Okay, this morning I'm going to be listening to some Boulez. This is a short piece, about 8 minutes long, for Pierrot Ensemble, Dérive from 1984. And you can see that in addition to your standard Pierrot Ensemble is vibraphone. So this is an example of Pierrot Plus, which is probably more common than not having percussion, as you might have gathered from this series. And here's the first system. And this score was given to me by a teacher because he wanted me to study it. I was writing a piece for Pierrot Ensemble at the time. And this is one of the very few scores he actually asked me to look at, maybe 3 or 4 pieces over the course of 2 years. And yeah, it definitely gave me a very strong impression, and communicated very strongly what my teacher wanted me to write, I could say. But otherwise I have not really looked at it that much, so I'm interested in it, and I'd like to get to know it in the context of all these other Pierrot Ensemble pieces I've been listening to. Let's look into the piece a little bit. In my experience, Boulez has a lot of good info. There's a lot of good info out there on him. So he's a very influential French composer and conductor, and he founded several musical institutions in France, some of which we've talked about already, such as IRCAM. And I guess his biggest pieces are Le Marteau Sans Maître, the Hammer Without a Master, and I think Répons is pretty big too. And his list of pieces is quite small. I'll show you here. He had his hand in a lot of things in French culture, so he's a very busy man, and he had a habit of revising a lot of his scores. So the actual number of them of published scores is quite small. I would imagine this is like 40 pieces or something. And we're looking at this one. So it derives material from 2 other pieces by the composer, Répons from 1981 and Message Suisse from 1977. And the latter piece was commissioned for Sacher's death, I believe. So this is another piece, along with that one, that uses the Sacher motive. I'll explain what I mean by Sacher here. So this is the last name of a very important figure in contemporary music. He commissioned a lot of pieces. And my professor was delighted to tell me about this. So E flat is also known as S. A, C, H is another way of saying B, E, and R is the letter before S, so in this case D. So this is the Sacher motive. It's a series of pitch classes: E flat, A, C, B, E, D. It starts with this very distinctive tritone, and it's going to be important in this piece. So if you want to study it, this is where to start here. So yeah, another thing I remember about this piece is my teacher really tried to make me notice what he was doing with tempo in the latter half of the piece. And he was doing something where as the tempo got slower, the note durations got faster, and vice versa. So there was this play with how the performers perceive things and how that changes the energy of performance, even though the note durations aren't necessarily changing. So just a nerdy little thing to also pay attention to in the second half of this score. Yeah, so with that being said, let's get into this one. Okay, so I actually ended up listening to this twice because the first recording I found was closer to the correct duration as listed in the score, but it was a bit sloppy. Like, it was, the vibraphone and the piano were both too quiet the whole time, and just towards the end the vibraphone was like completely out of time with the rest of the ensemble, and it was just very distracting. So I decided to go with this recording instead. It's the Ensemble Intercontemporain with Pierre Boulez conducting, I think. So this is an ensemble that Boulez founded, and I think it's a more definitive recording, even though it's much quicker than the score. It's like 6 minutes. With this, I could hear everything very clearly, and I knew what was going on the whole time. And yeah, it's a really nice piece with a very strong compositional idea behind it all. And it all kind of sticks to the same couple of gestures and these flourishes alternating with sustained chords. Some interesting things was, like, in the middle of the piece there was a moment without much flute, and then when the flute came back it really went into this nice climax. There's also this idea of certain pitches being kind of fixed in their registers, and admittedly I already knew this was a feature of the piece. I didn't like discover it or anything, but looking out for it, you can really hear how important that high F is in the opening, and also this like sustained A, like A octave in the piano, is really noticeable, and I think is also some sort of manifestation of that idea of like registrally specific sort of pitches. And I just felt the whole thing was very cool, and I liked a lot of the contrapuntal lines that came out of the texture when it was performed correctly. I think my favorite part was the cello pizzicato moment, and you know, this tempo stuff is an interesting feature of the piece too. If you look, the second half of it keeps getting faster until you get back to the opening tempo, which is half speed, right? So it climbs from, you know, eighth equals 40, I'm assuming, to eighth equals 80, and then it goes back down to quarter equals 40. And throughout that whole section, it does, Boulez does play with note durations in a very subtle way, and it's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting way to push the piece forward. I don't know how audible it is. I think it makes a big difference to the performers and the conductor. You'll definitely see it speeding up. You'll see the conductor speeding up, but I don't know how audible the speed up is. So if anything, it is something interesting to think about, like the role of the conductor as a performer, not just a director. So yeah, that's this one, and I think this is a staple. It's like a classic Pierrot Ensemble piece, and I think it's probably one of the most performed Pierrot Ensemble pieces. Certainly, as a Canadian, I feel like Boulez has a presence that's very felt. If you've studied with anyone who has worked in Montreal or like graduated from McGill, for example, you can feel that influence of Boulez and what he did really with his career. The next couple of days we're going to get into some more lesser known pieces by some of my colleagues, and both of them are for Pierrot plus viola, which is something that we haven't seen a lot of yet. So, and actually the Grise piece after that is also Pierrot plus viola. So that's something to explore, and if you're a violist, maybe it'll interest you. Or if you play in a string trio, maybe that'll interest you. So, yeah. We're just going to keep moving on tomorrow morning.